I'm here to talk about biodiversity, nature and health and the relationship between those. And I want to give a fairly rapid and run through of what is quite a broad, complex area. My background, as you know, is in health, or at least half of my life has been in health. Originally in the clinical sector, but predominantly for the last 20-odd years working in public health. And it was after that move into public health, part of that education is we learn about what we call the wider determinants of health. And that essentially highlights for me that health is something that's not really dealt with by people who work in health. Health is determined by people who work in lots of other sectors. The people in health deal with illness, largely. Some of us in the public health sector, and apologies to those of you who are, do, of course, look at prevention and promotion. But for people in the clinical sector, they're dealing with illness. And the things that make us ill are usually out of the control of those people. So with things like poverty and education and housing. And one of the other determinants, and probably one of the key ones, is the environment. So my presentation really is looking at the role of the environment, and of course in the context of today, the natural environment in particular, and its role in health. And it's a very topical issue, but it's not a new issue by any means. If we go back 2,500 years, who else but the ancient Greeks and our old friend Hippocrates identified the physician treats, but nature heals. Leap forward now to the 16th century, and a very clever man called Paracelsus, Swiss scientist, identified that the art of healing comes from nature, not from the physician. Therefore, the physician must start with nature with an open mind. And then I didn't put this next quote in just because she's got an interesting name, but the lady by the name of Louisa Lust at the beginning of the 20th century noted that do not under any circumstances shut the air and sunshine from your home. Do not mind if the furniture, the curtains, the draperies, etc. will fade. It is better to let them fade than you should. The inference obviously being that nature actually has a really important part to play in our health and well-being. Coming forward a little, both in time and in geography, this is a picture taken of the Abergele Sanatorium back in the 1930s. Evidently, this is the children's ward by the look of it. And of course, the sanatoriums were established to deal with TB, which was a significant health issue in those days. And the physicians at the time recognized the critical importance of the natural environment and the fresh, clean air in the treatment regimen of people who suffered from TB. If we take a look now at some of the specific roles of nature and health, I wanted to start with something very specific here. This is pharmaceuticals. And we can go back 3,000 years BC when we find Egyptian pharmaceutical records which documented over 700 plant-based drugs. Around about the same time in Mesopotamia, they were talking about oils from the cypress trees and from myrrh, and these are still in use today to treat coughs, colds, and inflammation. Indeed, an awful lot of our most important drugs for treating ill health have their origins in the natural world. And a study back in 2012 identified that there's between 35,000 and 70,000 plant species that have been screened for their medicinal use. So without nature, we really would be struggling to treat many of the ailments that we suffer from in the modern world. But it's not just about drugs. And a really interesting, I'm sure many of you in the room would be familiar with this, a really interesting piece of work came out in the early 80s from a chap called Edward O. Wilson, who proposed the Biophilia Hypothesis. And that suggests that humans possess an innate tendency to seek connections with nature and other forms of life. And the book goes on to describe what the implications of that are for human beings. And I've tried to capture that in a very pithy, short, and probably doesn't do justice to the man, but my interpretation of what he was saying is that human beings originated and evolved in natural environments, and we retain that primal unconscious need to maintain that link. Without it, our health suffers, and with it, our health improves. Well, what about the evidence? I work in a field where evidence is everything, really. And we're constantly being told that what we do needs to have some kind of evidence base. Well, there is a very wide range of evidence for the benefits of the natural environment on health. It's not all good evidence. There's an awful lot of poor evidence out there, but amongst it, there is some very really good empirical evidence. This is just a selection, a fairly random selection of some of the studies that I came across. One study found that walks in the forest were specifically associated with decreased levels of anxiety and bad mood, and another that outdoor walks could usefully, clinically, act as a supplement to existing treatments for major depressive disorders. ADD, which is attention deficit disorder, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Researchers in Illinois showed that children diagnosed with these conditions concentrate better and have a general reduction of symptoms after spending time in nature. Importantly, this dose of green doesn't need to be a major excursion. Benefits have been seen in a simple walk down a tree-lined street, and I will be returning briefly to the idea of dose response shortly. In stress, another study, researchers found a decrease both in heart rate and levels of cortisol, which is a naturally occurring substance in the body which is generated in times of stress, in subjects in the forest compared to those in the city. Stressful states can be relieved by forest therapy, researchers concluded. And it's not just mental health. Mental health is particularly important, as many of you will know today. It's probably the area where there are significantly greater increases in ill health in the population than almost anywhere else. But there are physical health benefits. Elderly patients who've been sent on a week-long trip into the forest showed reduced signs of inflammation and indications that there were positive effects on their hypertension, which is high blood pressure. Forest bathing, which seems kind of niche to me, but nonetheless, there's some research out there, has been reported to increase natural killer cell activity and intracellular anti-cancer proteins, suggesting the beneficial effects of nature on the immune system and its cancer preventive potential. And then we mustn't forget this very famous study from the 1980s, which is often cited, caused a bit of a stir at the time, where evidence suggesting that views of nature expedite healing after surgery. And in a randomized trial, in this experiment, half of patients stayed in rooms with views of trees after their surgery. The other half had a view of a brick wall. Patients with a natural view spent less days in hospital, used less painkillers, and reported a more positive overall recovery experience. So the evidence seems to be stacking up that we have something really powerful here that we need to be making better use of, perhaps. But that's nature in general. Given the audience and the focus of this conference, I did want to touch, where I could, more specifically on biodiversity. And I wanted to convey something that happened to me about 18 months ago when I received an email which was exciting, flattering, and alarming in equal measure, really, because it came from an organisation that I never heard of. Many of you in the room may very well be familiar with them, which is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And they're responsible for producing international reports on biodiversity and ecosystems. And this report that they were working on had a chapter on health, and they wanted me to act as an external reviewer to look at that chapter. And after considering it for a couple of days, I went back to them and said I was very flattered by the approach. I don't quite know where they got my name from, but it's nonetheless, I was very flattered. However, whilst I feel reasonably confident in my knowledge and understanding of health, I couldn't pretend to be any kind of expert in the field of biodiversity. But they were very reassuring and said, that's fine, that's exactly what they were looking for, and it was only one chapter. So in the end, I agreed. So they sent me the chapter, which turned out initially to be 263 pages long, so the size of a small book. It was also very technical, very detailed, very scientific. But nonetheless, I did my bit and returned my views on the chapter. And that report has been subsequently published. I think it's actually been culled to about 180 pages in the health chapter. I do highly recommend it, though. There's some really interesting stuff in there. And the reason I bring this up now, apart from the fact it's obviously related to the topic, is it also for me, captures the breadth of this relationship. Within that one chapter, there are sections that cover medicines, food, water, air quality, infectious diseases, zoonoses, non-communicable diseases, slightly oddly, livestock protection and guard dogs, which I think is a big issue in Eastern Europe, as well as physical, mental and social health. So there's an awful lot of interesting stuff in there. There are also recommendations, and I just picked out two fairly at random for those in the audience who may have a research background. The current evidence base needs expanding to illuminate the scope and complexity of the biodiversity and health relationship and their importance to health outcomes. Moreover, there is even less empirical evidence about the inequities emerging from the different control over and access to these contributions. So maybe some opportunities there for the research community to engage. Coming back briefly to dose response, which, for those of you not from a clinical background, is essentially used to determine the effectiveness of drugs. So how much of a drug do you need, for how long and how often? If we took penicillin, nowadays it tends to be 7 days, although the evidence suggests you can take it for less time. And dependent on the type of drug it is, will depend how often you take it and in what dosage. But we can apply the same to other things, and exposure to nature has proved to be an interesting one. So do we get the benefits, same benefits to health, walking in a national park as you get from a window box? One study did look and it identified limited hard evidence, but did report that dose-response analysis for depression and high blood pressure suggested visits to outdoor green spaces of 30 minutes or more during the course of a week could reduce the population prevalence of these illnesses by up to 7% and 9% respectively. For me, the takeaway message around all this evidence is that any exposure to nature has positive health benefits. I put that caveat in there, safety hazards accepted. I think falling off a cliff, drowning or being eaten alive by a grizzly bear probably isn't good for your health, but that's all contextual, obviously. So there, quickly as I run through some of the theory and the evidence discussions that happen around this topic. What do we know about the practical application? Well, there's a lot going on. In the UK at an international level, Walking for Health programmes have been running in the UK for the best part of 20 years and continue to this day, and across Wales there are a lot of them. And these are programmes specifically for patients at risk of or with a range of health conditions. Care farms from the Netherlands, that's something that came out in the 70s and 80s and has emerged and is now very popular again across most of the Western world. And that's where groups of patients, predominantly those with mental health problems or addiction problems, behavioural problems, get enormous benefit simply from being on working farms and contributing to working farms. The social prescribing and green prescribing programmes that are emerging nowadays, and there's a lot of them in Wales, and I know a lot of people in the audience will have a lot of interest in that. They've emerged really off the back of the exercise prescription programmes, which were very good, and then we run one nationally in Wales, but do tend to focus mostly on indoor activity within leisure centre settings. The social prescribing and green prescribing model recognises not everybody likes to do work in the gym, but they might very well like to get out into the open air, into the forests, into the green areas, and do activities there, which we're showing having huge health benefits. Forest therapy is a Japanese inspired idea, and in Sweden they have a lot of experience with nature-based rehabilitation. I won't go through these individually because we're running out of time, but there is a lot going on in Wales. A lot of it led by the environment sector, the national parks, Coelhola, who I know here today, the Glamorgan Wildlife Trust have got a programme. We talked about social farms and gardens, the care farm, community gardens, a lot of those in Wales. And recently, 4 of the big national third sector organisations in the environment sector have come together to try and further develop the work around social prescribing particularly, but their responses to health. Specifically, in the NHS, there's a lot of work going on. So Ones of particular note are in Landock Hospital, where they have a large space, a green space that they've developed for patients and staff and the community. But there are a lot of things happening. A lot of them are walk-based or garden-based. And not forgetting there is the NHS Forests. This sprang out of the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare. Don't have much of a presence in Wales at the moment. We are talking to them, and they will be coming across the bridge very soon to talk to us further about what they can do in Wales. The Canals and Rivers Trusts have a very close eye on the health and well-being agenda, and their most recent reports have confirmed that they're interested in that. And there's a lot of academic interest in this. The Valuing Nature programme, particularly the Coast Web project, which is looking at biodiversity and ecosystems associated with salt marshes in 2 areas of Wales, and recently the establishment of the All Wales Social Prescribing Research Network. I just slotted this in because I came across it by accident. I think it's a really nice little infographic. It actually comes from the Philippines. I don't know what the copyright issues might be with that, but it's quite good. And finally, we've already heard from Jacob about the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, but also that there's the Environment Wales Act. And I wanted to talk about this because, of course, as many of you will know, there is a biodiversity duty. To comply with that duty, most public authorities must prepare and publish a plan setting out what they propose to do to maintain and enhance biodiversity and promote resilience. I can tell you now that in the health sector, all of them are required to meet this duty. I suspect none of them really even know that this duty applies to them at the moment, and certainly probably won't know what they're supposed to do about it. There is an opportunity there for people in the audience to engage with our colleagues in the health sector to help them with that. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, I don't need to go on any further because Jacob has obviously described the opportunities that provides very well. We have taken it up within Public Health Wales with our colleagues in NRW to develop an accord, recognising the synergy between our 2 organisations. And I won't go into the details of that, but essentially this is a list of activities, aims and objectives that we hope to do together to support this agenda. That just about brings me to an end. The references for the research are in this presentation, so I'm happy to make these available to people subsequently. Thank you.